따로 정리를 해드릴 테니까 지금부터 그러면 그 어제 있었던 그 인터뷰 실황을 함께 시청하시겠습니다.
So, with unprecedented economic turmoil and political conflict, the long-term viability of the WTO is a question. Some people argue that the architecture of the WTO system is insufficient and needs to be reformed. Today, we'll discuss about the role of the WTO and what needs to be changed. Also, whether the new leader from ongoing election can make these critical changes. I'm going to discuss these important and timely questions with Annabel Gonzalez, former trade minister from Costa Rica and also former director from the WTO. Hi, Annabel.
Hi.
Yeah, so the U.S. refused to appoint judges to the organization's top dispute settlement panel, the appellate body, last year. Meanwhile, recently the WTO ruled that tariffs the U.S. imposed on Chinese goods were inconsistent with international trade rules. But can the WTO enforce the U.S. to change their actions? And also, without the fully functioning appellate body, what functions the WTO can actually play?
So thank you. First, thank you very much, Julian, for this invitation to come to the show. And let me start by saying that the trade and investment policy landscape had become characterized by three features. First, the revival of managed trade, a policy focused on achieving concrete outcomes through government intervention. And this includes, we know, the return of the tariff and other measures like voluntary export restraints, utilized to pursue national security, as you said, and economic objectives, increased export controls, increased investment screening, complementing basically managed trade against the backdrop of great power rivalry and systemic competition between the US and China. So a second feature was greater fragmentation of trade rules, with a flurry of activity leading to new or revised agreements with potential competing spheres of influence. And though some of these agreements are, of course, very important to underpin global supply chains, competing visions in areas like the digital economy risk bringing differentiated standards and further consolidating emerging divisions in the digital space. And the third feature is the weakening of global governance. And here, as you rightly pointed out, two immediate actions have brought the WTO to confront its most fundamental crisis since coming into force in 1995. The use and abuse of the national security exception and the paralysis of the appellate body. But complex tensions complex concerns underline tensions in the multilateral trading system even from before. Whether and how to redefine the level playing field to better address market distorting state intervention in the economy, how to reform the WTO rules to fit the digital economy, and what role for developing countries in the system as they become central players in the global economy. So against this background of managed trade, of greater fragmentation, and weakening of the global governance, the WTO needs to deliver to remain relevant. So on the rulemaking front, one of the key functions of the WTO, the answer, in my view, lies in the negotiation of plurilateral agreements initiated by groups of interested countries that are open to all members. Negotiations in this format are already taking place in e-commerce, investment facilitation, and other areas. And one could think, for example, right now, an agreement to liberalize trade in critical medical supplies could probably be added to this list. On the dispute settlement front, while a more permanent solution is found to the paralysis of the appellate body, more countries could join the temporary appeal arbitration arrangement recently put in place by some 20 countries, including the European Union, China, Brazil, among others. This mechanism preserves an independent and impartial appeal stage. And finally, improved monitoring and transparency could happen with an enhanced role for the WTO Secretariat, the use of technology, and maybe some nudging from external sources.
This is great. So I'm going to jump to the third question, actually. So the WTO is searching for a new leader. And South Korean Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee is among the remaining 5 candidates. In your view, who is likely to be the final Director General of the WTO?
That's a difficult question,
Yes.
Judy.
Yeah.
The WTO process for selecting the DG started off, as you know, with a very strong slate of 8 candidates. We're now down to 5, and this week we will learn who will be the 2 final candidates. The Financial Times and other media have reported that South Korea Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee is in a very strong position, and she's certainly a very solid candidate, in my view. Now, I don't know who the next WTO DG will be, but what I do know is that the new Director General will find a full plate when stepping into the office. The WTO is at a crossroads. We know it faces multiple non-COVID and COVID-related challenges across some of the dimensions that we have been discussing. So amid this complex and politically charged agenda, the first order of priority for a new Director General, in my view, should be to help restore a minimum of trust in global trade cooperation. The DG will need to get the WTO members, particularly the largest among them, to engage and work together, even if hesitantly. The WTO is a member-driven organization. And to me, the most pressing area right now is to tackle the detrimental trade measures put in place to address COVID-19 and negotiate the deal to liberalize trade in medical products. And delivering a quick breakthrough on urgent matters could help restore confidence in the WTO relevance and pave the way for greater collaboration, I think one step at a time. I think that the next DG will find that it's messy and it's hard, but I think that's what it will be required from the new Director General.
Do you think the new DG can actually make a significant change? You know the WTO much better than anybody else, but like with all those members, such as protectionism in the US and elsewhere, is it even possible job for the new DG?
It is a very tough job, and there needs to be a recognition about that. And it is, so I want to say 2 things. One, it is a member-driven organization, and it is for members to take the responsibility for negotiations and for reaching agreements. Having said that, I do think that the Director General has a very important leadership job to play, to bring in the parties, to push the process forward, to bring other members as well, not only the larger parties, but other members as well. And there is, in my view, a very important role also for the Secretariat. The Secretariat right now has been putting out, for instance, a number of papers looking at the impact of restrictions on trading goods, the impact of COVID on trading services, looking at it from the perspective of trade facilitation. And all these notes are valuable input to promote a dialogue among members in the WTO. I think the new Director General could foster that dialogue, because that is the starting point. And, it may sound like it's not too much, but having this dialogue at a high level in the context of the WTO, facilitated by the Director General, to me, it's a very important starting point. And I remain confident that the next WTO Director General will be able to do it, because I think this person will come in with a goodwill on the parts of the members, and the members will be looking forward to her or his leadership.
Yeah, but how is this selection process? Is it purely driven by international politics, or does each member value a lot about the credential or the qualification of the candidates as well?
I think it is a bit of a mix, in the sense that I think the qualifications of the individual candidate are relevant. Their leadership skills, their trajectory, their expertise in the area of trade. To me, all of this are very important qualifications. But there is also a role that that is associated with the country or government that is supporting the candidate, because there is the need for a big diplomatic effort to be deployed. And particularly in this area, it's also challenging because of the restrictions on traveling. So it's very important to be able to reach out on the ground, to connect digitally. And for that, the support of government is very, very relevant.
Yeah, I mean, this is some side question that, like, WTO, in my view, is a very technical and very legal-oriented place where a lot of lawyers discuss about trade. Meanwhile, for instance, the World Bank, there's a lot of economists, and there's UNCTAD and OECD. So all those different organizations somewhat have their own voice. Like, what extent they are actually collaborating, something like COVID-19 issue, and how, like, international community, if we thinking about reforming the WTO itself, do you think we need to reform this international community to dealing with trade?
Well, the collaboration among organizations is very relevant because all of them serve governments, and for governments, it's important that each of these organizations serve its purpose. So I think each of them have a different role. Like, for instance, in the case of the World Bank, the World Bank is supporting member countries with the challenges that they're facing right now, which may be related to COVID-19, it may be related to additional infrastructure, it may be related to reform of the government, it may be related to improving the business environment. And the IMF, of course, is providing support on the fiscal front, and this, in the context of COVID-19, is very important. And the role of the WTO in particular is to help establish a framework, a solid and strong framework that would facilitate trade to flow, as freely and as predictably as possible. And we already have a strong framework. It has been weakened by the factors that we have been discussing, but I think we must not forget that the framework is there. It's at the service of the members, and it is to WTO members to actually make a good use of this institution, working in collaboration with the other institutions, including UNCTAD and OECD, as you were mentioning.
Yeah, well, like you mentioned that WTO is a member-driven institution, like many other organizations, but it often says that the Trump administration hinders the WTO as a reversion to protectionism. However, actually, the Obama administration initiated the practice of blocking appellate body candidates in 2011. And in 2016, it also prevented the reappointment of a Korean judge on the objection that he was acting outside his mandate, which I remember that received a lot of international criticism. So do you think if Biden is elected as the president of the United States, in case, do you think he would have a different approach from Trump in dealing with trade and WTO?
I think we need to look at this from at least two perspectives. The first one is that on substantive issues, there is a need to reform the WTO. And I think that this view is shared in the US across party lines. And I'm referring, for instance, on the need to develop rules, strengthen rules to deal with industrial subsidies, on the contribution of developing countries to the system, on the need for digital rules to govern the digital economy. These are issues where the WTO needs to move forward with increased rulemaking. And I think in the US, irrespective of whatever administration comes into being, these are issues that are important to tackle. Having said that, I think that a potential Biden administration will put more emphasis on working with allies and collaboration. And this is very, very relevant because what the Trump administration has basically used either unilateral measures or at best bilateral agreements, but has not really worked in the context of the WTO. Whereas I expect that we would see a Biden administration working more closely with allies in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, and other places, trying to develop rules in some of these areas that we were discussing, and also working in the context of the WTO, where we need the engagement of those large members to actually deliver. So I would expect a very different approach, although it is important to recognize that some of the substantive issues will still need to be addressed.
Well, I think Trump is not really happy with the WTO, and there was a rumor that the U.S. might be withdraw from the WTO. I don't know if it's true, but also Trump, as you said, is very focused on bilateral agreement or like regional agreements such as RCEP or Indo-Pacific, while he didn't like TPP. He's recreating something similar in the same region. So, do you think Biden would do you think he will much pro for multilateralism than the bilateralism in terms of trade?
I would expect to see greater engagement at the multilateral level. There may be greater engagement at the regional level. And I think at the bilateral level, there are some issues, of course, that need to be sorted out between the U.S. and China, for instance. And some of these issues can be, sorted out in the context of the WTO, but some of them are really more of a bilateral nature. And I would expect that certain negotiations, for instance, that are ongoing could continue. For example, a U.S.-Kenya free trade agreement negotiations that are taking place right now. But I would not expect a bilateral approach, which is bilateral/unilateral approach, as the one that has been taken in the current administration. I wouldn't expect that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Annabelle. Is there anything you want to share with the Korean audiences about trade or WTO, and anything you want to share?
Well, I think that the engagement of countries like Korea is very critical, because these are countries that have benefit greatly from the integration into the international economy, and a stable and predictable environment is critical to continue to grow. So I would look forward to great engagement on the part of Korea in these negotiations, and hopefully, 2021 will bring us greater efforts to see a revitalized WTO. So thank you very much for having me, Yun.
Thank you. Thanks, Annabelle.
네, 아유, 정말, 저희뿐만 아니라,
예.
우리 끝까지 시청했던 분들 모두에게 감사드리는 의미에서 박수 한번 칩시다.
아유,
아유.